Welcome to the Peep Show podcast.
News and stories from the sex industry.
With Jesse and PJ Sage. Welcome back to another episode of the Peep Show podcast. This week we bring you a recording from the panel Consent and Sexualized Leisure at AVN. Lynn Comella moderates this discussion about how consent is negotiated on the showroom floor with performers Katy Jayne and Jessica Drake and scholars Barb, Brents, and Paul Maginn.
This episode of the Peep Show podcast is sponsored by Quick and Dirty Media.
Are you an independent content creator, webcam model, or clip maker? Quick and Dirty Media can help you with your video editing and production needs at a reasonable price, allowing you to devote more time to creating your content. As a special offer for Peep Show podcast listeners, the first 5 content creators who submit a video for editing will receive their first order free. Make sure to use the promo code PeepShowPod. Find Quick and Dirty Media on Twitter at QuickDirtyMedia or send an email to info@quickanddirtymedia.com. Quick and Dirty Media is proud to be an adult-friendly business.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Peep Show podcast.
Welcome.
So today we have a panel from AVN 2020, which took place all the way back in January.
Yeah, it's been a minute.
But don't worry, it ages like a fine vintage wine.
Yes.
No, at least that's what we tell ourselves.
No, I mean, obviously we had a lot of health issues going on between then and now, so we weren't able to get to it. But going back and listening to it has been really interesting because PJ's right. It is still really relevant because while we're not standing on the expo floor anymore, what the performers and the academics that were on the panel are talking about have much broader implications for how we interact as performers with fans, how we negotiate consent in our jobs.
One of the funny things was that they were talking about was the way they didn't say ManyVids by name in the panel, but 98.995% sure that they were talking about the ManyVids booth, which you actually...
Yeah, I worked at the ManyVids booth this year.
And one of the issues with the ManyVids booth that was controversial was that it was really tall this year. I don't know, you were 5 feet above the fans.
Yeah, it was ridiculously tall. And this is one of the conversations that comes up in the panel, but there's safety measures that take place and putting performers up on risers is one of them. But that actually made it much more difficult for people like me, people who aren't really big stars, to even interact with the expo goers, with the fans and the people who've come to the expo at all. We were so far removed from being able to talk to them.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point, right? And I think actually kind of a point that maybe implicitly comes up in the panel because the performers who were on the panel are mega stars and they're awesome and they have lots of important things to say. But there are even more people at AVN who are performers who are trying to build a name for themselves and, cam models, clip producers, other folks who are, really trying to build their business. And they're coming to the expo, not necessarily to sign autographs for a long line of adoring fans that they already have, but they're really trying to hustle out there on the expo floor and meet new fans, right? And so different performers who are going to the event have different needs and different goals. And I think that's, one of the things that kind of comes up implicitly in this conversation. Is certainly something that we thought a lot about while listening to the panel. Yeah,
because the whole conversation is about safety and consent on the expo floors. But what I think a conversation that we need to have is how accessible do we need to be depending on where we fall within the industry in order for it to even be worthwhile for us to come and work the floor like that.
Yeah, and I think it's tough for a site like ManyVids because they really do have such a huge range of, they have people who have 1 million Twitter followers and people who have 1,000 Twitter followers. Mm-hmm. And I think you even talked to Bella French, the CEO, a little bit about this when you were working there. But I think it's a tension for the platforms
Well, yeah, and they actually brought this up in the panel. And I mean, we don't want to scoop the whole panel, but I mean, one of the things that I think Lynn and Barb brought up is that when you are so far removed from the floor, if you actually want to talk to somebody, it kind of is counterproductive because I had this experience where people that I knew and I wanted to talk to, I actually, in order to have any sort of meaningful interaction, had to come out from around the booth and stand on the floor with the expo goers and talk to them from there, which is even less safe than if we were at floor level. So yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of things to consider. So what they were looking at in this study that they're talking about in the panel is kind of the geography of expo floors and how they're set up and what kind of considerations go into setting them up for performers, for fans. What's the best way to go about doing something? And I think that maybe one of the more interesting questions that wasn't addressed as head on, but is implicit in this conversation is that it depends on who you are and where you are in the industry.
Yeah, for sure. I think what's important to recognize is that AVN and many of the other adult expos sort of came into being around the mainstream porn industry. And mainstream porn performers, of course, work with other models, right? So they're as part of their job, but also historically have done featured dancing and increasingly are involved in escorting and other kinds of physical engagement with fans. So often they're pretty accustomed to physical interactions, whereas cam models, historically have been solo performers. Many cam models don't even work with a partner on cam, right? They work with a dildo or they work with, a fuck machine or something. So for many cam models, they're much more out of their element at a big expo where people are expecting to be able to touch them. So it's trying to I think to some degree, educate the audience that different performers are going to be comfortable with very different things and they can't go in with assumptions about what a performer is going to be comfortable with.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was one of the really interesting things about this panel discussion too, is that Katy Jayne and Jessica Drake talked a lot about the ways that they as performers serve as educators as well and work to kind of change the cultural conversations around how you interact with performers. But I think one of the things that you're bringing up is important, which is that this isn't a one-size-fits-all answer. It's something that, as performers, as educators, as sex workers, that part of the job is interfacing and teaching customers and clients and fans how to be in these spaces.
Right. And that's especially true in a society where we do a pretty poor job of teaching consent in general. And so people are coming in without a lot of tools to understand and talk about consent. I mean, I do think that's changing to some degree because of social media, because of culture, but it's not really changing in institutions like in schools, right? So we have really a long way to go in talking about consent more thoughtfully in the broader culture. Yeah, and so that's why I think, even though it's been a minute, I do think that it's great to be able to, platform these discussions and bring them outside of the expo, because even people who were at AVN, there's so much going on there. It's not as if you could possibly go to all of the events and all of the talks and all of the educational seminars. And so we're happy to give you a little slice of what those look like. Definitely. And so we'll turn to the panel in a second. But before we do, I also just wanted to say our store is live and we've got stickers, buttons, shirts, all sorts of things that you can buy, which is really great because you can help support Peep Show by doing that. And our supplies are already dwindling, but we've placed some big orders for mugs and more shirts and tote bags and other things.
Yeah, and as soon as production starts back up again, we will have those. So in the meantime, feel free to look at what's there, and there's more cool stuff that's coming.
Yeah, and help Peep Show stay on the air with your purchase.
Yeah, so please go to our store. It's at peepshowmedia.com. I also want to say that we've been, one of the things that we haven't talked that much about is that our new website that we have put up, we are using also to do some feature interviews, to publish some essays. And so we've been doing a little bit of that.
And also product reviews and recommendations.
Yes, which PJ does. And that's been really cool. So if you haven't already, please go check out our website because it's more than just the podcast. We have a lot of new content up there that, runs a range from interviews and essays and podcast episodes to product reviews and silly pictures. So please check out the website. It's peepshowmedia.com.
Okay, let's get to the panel.
All right, let's get to it.
Thanks for joining us today. Jesse and I are dedicated to platforming sex worker voices and covering important political issues for those in the sex trades. But we can't do it without your help.
If you believe in our mission, find us at patreon.com/peepshowpodcast and show us some love.
We're also seeking advertisers to help us grow. Thanks for helping us make Peep Show happen.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. This panel is titled Consent and Sexualized Leisure at the AVN show. And I'm going to be moderating this panel. My name is Lynn Comella. I'm an associate professor of gender and sexuality studies at UNLV, which is the university in Las Vegas that is literally a stone's throw away from the Hard Rock. And I'm really pleased to be moderating what I think is going to be a really interesting discussion about consent broadly, but even more specifically in a trade show space. And we have the opportunity to not only hear from academic researchers who've studied this question, but also performers who have the lived experience of having to navigate the issue of consent in this space and in other spaces. So real quickly, I'm joined to my left by Jessica Drake, who is a contract performer for Wicked, as well as a certified sex educator. Katy Jayne is the other performer who's joining us. And then our two academic researchers are Paul Maginn from the University of Western Australia and Barb Brents, also from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And Paul is a geographer and Barb is a sociologist, so that gives you a little bit of an idea of their disciplinary backgrounds. I think when most people think of the Adult Entertainment Expo, they likely picture loud music and free swag, big crowds and late-night parties, and sexy performers signing autographs and posing for pictures alongside some of their most adoring fans. While all of this, as we know, is true, what people probably don't realize is that a number of academic researchers also descend on the expo every year, hoping to learn more about the social and economic organization of the adult industry, about the experiences of those who labor within it, and also about the fans and consumers who help, importantly, keep the industry afloat. Today, we'll pull back the curtain on some of the research that's been done on the expo to discuss a recently published study by a team of researchers, two of whom are with us today, but not the whole team. And that study looks specifically at issues of consent and sexualized leisure at the AVN Expo. And the hope is that this discussion can be a springboard for larger conversations about consent, not only in the adult industry space, but also in the culture more broadly. So I'm going to be posing some questions to people, and we also hope that there's some organic conversation that happens amongst and between the panelists. And then we want to, importantly, leave at least 10 minutes for questions from the audience. So we'll kind of, hang on for questions until the end, but we'll make sure that I cut these folks off so we can get to you. So I want to start just by asking Paul and Barb to talk a little bit about the study that they conducted, including why you were interested in learning more about the AVN Expo and its fans. If you can give us some of that background so people in the audience have a sense of the who, why, what of your research.
All right. Well, thank you very much. It's really an honor to be up here with some great educators and scholars. We just have different venues in which we educate. It's a real pleasure to be here. The AVN Expo is a magical place in which to look at a microcosm of things that are going on in the world at large. Gender relations, obviously gender fluidity, sexuality, the interplay between leisure, entertainment, and intimacy. All these things, I could go on and on. I'm a geeker scholar, everything. It's just a great place to look. So a number of years ago, some other folks and I got together to do a survey of fans and attendees at the expo just to see who goes. This was in 2009 we started doing this, and we've had an article or so published from that. And then a couple years ago, Paul from Australia said, hey, let's do this again, and I've got some ideas. So we did a survey that some of you probably answered, we gave to fans, and then we also did some observations. This particular article that we're talking about today looks at the negotiation of consent in the AVN space. Our motivation was because, as you know, there's a lot of scholarly research that talks about the negative effects of pornography, and that there's no possibility of having consent within the confines of the expo, but we know that as objective scholars to not be true. So that's where this article is coming from. And we can talk about some of the findings, but I think it's a much more interesting discussion to have about how consent is negotiated, especially in this Me Too moment. And also it's interesting to see how the AVN has changed over the years.
So just jumping in really quick, I think it would be useful if just briefly you could discuss some of the results. What did your research find related to the topic of consent? And also, was there anything in your findings that surprised you, that you didn't expect to find, but you nonetheless found?
I suppose if we look at the concepts of consent, we identified kind of two main types of consent. That would be institutional consent, and that's really about how the AVN frames the rules of engagement and interaction, particularly between, obviously, performers and fans. So you'll notice, when you register here, you have to sign a waiver form. When you walk into the main expo spaces, there's signage, and this year there's two signs that spell out very clearly what the rules are again, basically. So there's this institutional consent being reinforced throughout your experience as you move through this space. And then the second one, and this is at the pointy end of this kind of interaction between performers and fans, is individual consent, and how, performers, so obviously we've got Jessica and Katy here, how do they negotiate, frame, manage consent, and also how they negotiate and manage people who transgress consensual boundaries which are framed institutionally and which these guys frame individually at that moment of interaction with fans. So that's the big headline, basically.
I think that's the perfect segue to actually hear from the two performers on the panel in terms of both of those things. How do you negotiate and navigate the issue of consent at a trade show like AVN, but there's other trade shows, both at the institutional level, the rules of engagement that the show writ large puts in place, but also those one-on-one encounters where something's maybe not comfortable, or there's an interaction that is crossed bounds that you have not consented to. So if you want to talk anything that comes to mind regarding your experience.
Okay, hi. So I've had a very positive experience these expositions to date so far. The main form of communication that I think most of us performers use is Twitter, and I make a point at the beginning of every show to be like, hey, please come and say hello, but please don't touch us. And most of my fans are very supportive and understanding of that. The only time I've ever really had an issue is somebody would ask for a photograph of which I'd consent, And in that split second when the camera flashes, they will go for a quick grope. And by the time you've realized it's over and they're already on the other side of the room, and you're just left feeling frustrated because you didn't even have time to say anything, and you know that photo is a deer in headlights. So it's really tough. It's hard to enforce because when someone does breach, you can't reprimand them for it.
So, and I've been to a number of AVNs now. I'd like to first speak to what Paul said about institutional consent. The signs that are posted and the waivers that attendees have to sign are there for a reason. They're there because throughout the years, we have had problems as performers. And I don't want to make light of or make the Me Too movement any stronger in the adult community. It's just that we're such public people, we get a lot more attention because of it. So we have that in place, and even though we have that in place, things do still happen. And it can be a really tricky situation, like Katy mentioned, as far as navigating it, because on one hand, you want to always be super accessible and very friendly and make fans happy, right? You want to please the fans because they're here to see us. And at the same time, it's really important to define our own personal boundaries because they're going to be different from person to person. And I think that's also super important to acknowledge in this conversation. So for me, it's definitely been a learning process. I also come from a place of privilege because I'm under contract with Wicked Pictures, a great company that is always taking care of their performers. So I have signed in booths for Wicked over the years in a more protected space. So maybe I've been up on a riser or I've had a security guard beside me. All that being said, I think that performers are exceptionally open to consent violations on a show floor like this because when fans see us naked performing on screen, they feel as if they can relate to us on even a more intimate level, and maybe they know us better than they actually do just from having seen us have sex and seeing us on social media. So my method is, like Katy, I normally go into a show by posting something like I did. If anybody in this room follows me on Twitter, you saw what I posted yesterday. I usually just tell people, hey, I'm super cool as long as you're cool. This means don't stalk me. This means don't come after me in the hall or take pictures of me without my knowing. If someone puts their hands on me during a photo and this happens not as an adult performer as well, so let's just be clear, it happens to women all the time. If they do that, I stop them immediately and I tell them that it's not acceptable to do that. And if they meet me with any form of resistance at all, I want them gone. Period. And now, because of AVN's zero tolerance policy, that it makes enforcing that a lot easier for me to do. So also, if I see them doing it to somebody else, I'll be like, nope, don't do that. I'm very fast to be like, no.
One thing I wanted to say is, as a sociologist, as in observing the dynamic in the big field, there's a set of norms that exist. The customers and the fans are there because they want you to like them in some way, and so they will behave. I mean, I've been coming here long enough that I'm no longer surprised, but as a female out there in the world where I don't have the skills to manage consent like you all do, I was surprised at how behaved, quote unquote, compared to what the outside world might think, fans are. And so I want to make sure that that's an important point because that dynamic, this is a sexualized leisure environment where everybody is pro-sex and can feel comfortable with their sexuality. And yet there are still boundaries that are recognized by most people. And I think the boundaries are in a little bit of a different place. But this is what I'm interested in hearing you all talk about, because obviously here, a fan putting their hands on your behind to take a photo and all that, or grabbing your breast, that's okay for many people if there's permission granted. And that's not necessarily something a guy would ask permission for elsewhere if they were going to do that.
That's a really good point.
So
I've had more people recently, I'd say in the past 2 years, when they do take photos with me, ask may I put my hand around you? And I think that's really notable to mention. And yeah, it's the more common for fans to show respect here than I think a lot of people would expect out of the gate.
I want to follow up on that because that is really interesting. I mean, Barb used that word norms, which is a sociological term, but not only. But there seem to be norms that, norms or rules that fans, for the most part, know and seem to follow, which is interesting. And I'm wondering how much that might have to do with the fact that there are people like Katy and like Jessica that are taking time to educate their fan base via social media, for example, before a show like this. Like, hey, I want you to come up and say hello. I want to take a photo with you. I want to meet you. However, it's not a free-for-all. Like, my body's not here for your consumption, right? So it's not like that behavior exists in a vacuum. That behavior has kind of been educated, right? Or those fans have been educated. I just, what are your thoughts about, this is a bigger question, and I do want to talk about this. What are your thoughts about the role of adult performers in not just educating fans, but playing an increasingly important role in, prompting cultural conversations around consent more broadly? It's kind of a twofold question. Both of you mentioned social media, like putting it out there to your fans. Yeah, absolutely. Come, say hi. I'm down with that. But that's an intervention. That's a cultural intervention. You are educating your fans on your expectations. They can follow or not, but there likely be consequences if they don't, because now they can be ejected. But I think there's been increased conversation. And there's articles out there, there's media articles out there where, they focused on adult performers playing that key role in consent culture. Comments, responses?
I couldn't agree more with what you're saying. And one of the reasons I got into the adult industry is whether people like it or not, porn is a form of education. We can argue whether it should be, but we are in the front lines here, and everything we do is very impressionable. And for me, my motive in this industry, partly, is to show that you can be a sexual woman and a respectful woman, and the two don't have to be a contradiction. You can be intelligent, respectful, maternal, and still be this wonderful sexual creature who is worthy of love. And the privilege of being in this industry is being in the grassroots, the front lines, is I can say, hey, we set a precedent here, and you can infiltrate access to communities that perhaps being an educator in the academic world that you wouldn't have had otherwise. Thanks to social media, thanks to these conventions, you get a bigger reach and hopefully spread the message that we are worthy of respect. And I think most of the people here are such admirations of the industry. From my personal experience, most fans are just in awe of women, and I find them more respectful than when I previously used to work in an office job or when I used to work in retail. I used to work in a sex shop back in the UK, and men would be grabby when they're talking about lingerie and sex toys. And I find this industry, I've been respected far more than any other profession I've been in, ironically.
No, and I think that last point that you made really challenges a lot of the stereotypes that people have about fans or consumers or about the industry, right? That, it is possible to garner respect, right? Because there's such stigma that many people hold for the industry and for consumers.
If I can just pick up on the first paper that came out of this research, where we looked at male fans, what we call super fans. And these are people, mainly men, who come to this expo but who consume pornography on a fairly regular basis, basically. And we basically tested in our survey their gender attitudes, because the perception is that porn super fans, or porn fans in general, but then if you go to porn super fans, they're going to hold particularly kind of misogynistic and sexist attitudes. And what we found in our survey, and we asked 4 primary questions, which are also asked in the general social survey. So we were able to benchmark super fans against the general American population. And porn super fans actually hold more gender positive views about women and women's role within society as well. So I think that's a positive thing to take away. And I think within that there's understandings of what consent actually means when they do come into a sexualized, I say leisure because I'm from Belfast, I don't say leisure. So it's a sexualized leisure space, which is obviously hypersexualized. You know, when you come to here for the first time, as I did in 2015, and about half of our respondents had, when we did our survey, it was their first time here. And I think when you come into a hypersexualized space like this for the first time, it can be overwhelming, it can be awe-inspiring, and nervousness, and you meet your favorite performer, and there is a notion of what we called in the paper tacit consent, because these guys are here to interact with their fans, but there's still boundaries, and if you move around, some performers are very interactive, you know, very hands-on, so to speak, and I was kind of watching yesterday one performer who was directing the whole interaction. I mean, she took complete control, you know, of her interactions with her male fans. She didn't give them a chance to ask permission. She owned it big time. And it was like, you can touch me where I say you can touch me. And purposely put people, you know, on the part of her body where she obviously felt comfortable with.
I think that the reason performers in the adult industry can be such experts on consent is because this is something that we navigate all the time. Like, this is what we do when we're at work, and this is when it begins. I was talking to Katy yesterday about this, and I mean, for as long as I've been in the business, anytime I work with someone new, I always have that first meeting, right? Like, okay, this is what I like, this is what I don't like. You can do this to me, don't ever do this to me. If you want to do this, let's discuss this. You know, I've always had those boundary and consent meetings, but as far as what Lynn was saying about how we can possibly be modeling this behavior for the general public, right? We're also talking about a segment of people who are watching porn with no context, who are watching porn with no real sex education growing up. So I don't think at all that the onus of responsibility to educate falls on performer shoulders at all whatsoever. I do also think that there are so many people that are getting sex education from porn, and they shouldn't be. We know they shouldn't be. So as far as that, like, I would also love to see people just better able to navigate porn in general and understand that what you're seeing on the screen is a polished fantasy and the performers have negotiated consent prior. And maybe if they understand that a little bit better, they'll understand why we are so competent and why we do negotiate consent so well.
I'm curious. We talked a little bit about the institutional setting, and you've talked about how you as individuals negotiate. AVN a couple years ago did these big signs and signed this form. Is that enough? I mean, could there be more, dare I ask this, institutional support to help you all?
So I noticed immediately, as soon as attendees had to sign a consent form, they became more aware of their behavior. I mean, that's human nature. We do it for a lot of things. As soon as you write down a list, like, that becomes a thing to you. As far as, is it enough? I don't know that it's ever enough anywhere, right? But that being said, I think it's definitely made a big difference the first time I walked in. And I mean, we have to sign them as well. We have to sign the codes of conduct as performers. I think that's a fantastic idea. And the first time I did that, and the first time I stood in line and showed my ID and signed the paper, I thanked AVN for doing that. I was like, thank you so much for putting this in place. This is going to be so helpful to us. I also wish that there was some type of way. So Wicked Pictures just implemented a mandatory sexual harassment prevention online training program for anyone that's on our set, whether they're crew, whether they're talent. They take an online course. So we did that, and in doing that, we also have a way for folks to anonymously report a consent violation on set. So I wish that AVN or any place where adult performers were maybe had that ability, because sometimes multiple performers will notice that one particular fan has done it to many people, or maybe they're trying to get away with it, or maybe they've had a little too much to drink. So it would be really awesome if we had a way to report.
I think that would be a great idea, actually. But going back on that, I was going to say another problem we have. The thing is with what we're doing here, this is small scale. And generally in society, women's bodies are under such scrutiny. And in public space, women's bodies are often perceived as public property. And the discourse is generally that if I, a woman, am out once the sun has set, after my curfew, you could argue that my body is thus then public space, and whatever happens to me, she was asking for it. So what we're doing here, it's setting a precedent, but on a very small scale that hopefully, going back to what Jessica said, it's creating mindfulness. You know, if you don't state, hey, please don't stalk me, people might not even realize not to stalk you. But you do have to spell it out. And hopefully in time, we can hopefully create an influence that then people take, not just in the convention space, but outside of that space.
Can I just follow up on that? I mean, one of the issues that we highlighted in the paper, and as a researcher, I'm constantly kind of processing everything that happens in front of me as a form of data. What happens within the confines of the expo space, and then what happens when performers come out of the expo space and they're going through the lobby, for example, in the rooms? There is, and Jessica mentioned this yesterday when we had a quick meeting, and Katy as well, but from my observations as well, there's clearly another kind of what we call touristic gaze as opposed to sexuality gaze that happens within. And I think it's normal casino attendees who don't come to the expo, they don't understand what the consensual boundaries are, I think, in some senses. And I'm not sure if the people that approach you when you're moving through outside the normal bounds of the normal spaces of the casino, are they fans who are attending, or are they just general punters who are here and you're getting kind of different types of reactions in some way?
So predominantly, in my experience, I don't know about Katy, they are fans because that's why they're here right now. But at the same time, like maybe they're not specifically a fan of mine who has just waited in a line to get an autograph. Maybe they're just adult fans in general, and they just seize every opportunity to get closer to us in whatever way that looks like. I've had people run into an elevator right before the doors close so that they could be in that elevator with me. And then I'm like, well, I can't get off at my floor. I can't do this, you know. We were joking yesterday, I put on, and I'm gonna out myself right now because I put on a New York baseball cap and dark sunglasses, and I hug the side of the wall and I speed walk like you see people doing in the mall. Like that's how I get through this casino, just to like not make eye contact and just to get through. So, but it's a different type of attention than it is on the show floor for sure, because they're like, oh, what are you doing in line at Dunkin' Donuts? What are you ordering? What's your favorite coffee? What are you eating? Like, it's completely different.
I think that's such a great question. It's such an important point. And I've heard a handful of stories about performers. And actually, these were stories that were captured on the episode that Peep Show podcast did last year. And I want to give a shout out to them. It's a fantastic sex-positive podcast. Listen to it, download it, subscribe to it. But there were stories that were shared on their AVN episode last year by performers, camp performers in particular. And this particular woman shared several instances of being, you know, really aggressively accosted on elevators. Like, we might not think about the dangers that elevators risk to performers. I mean, performers know, right? But like maybe people who aren't kind of in the performer headspace don't think about the fact that there's the expo floor, there's the casino floor, and then there's the challenge of safely getting to wherever you're going, whether it's a party or your room. And, you know, this performer on this podcast was, you know, shared some stories that were frankly, you know, quite terrifying and could have ended, you know, in you know, a physical assault or sexual assault even, had it not been for bystander intervention or had it not been for a security guard intervening. And so space becomes really porous, like in the context of the expo, right? Like where somebody's desire to kind of interact with or meet a performer isn't confined just to the trade show floor. You know, there's the casino floor. There are those people that will stalk performers or who, after one too many drinks, is unable to process the boundary setting that is happening.
So because of some of those things that Lynn is mentioning, I wear a personal security device on my finger. I'm going to tell you what it is. I don't get paid from them. It's called NIM. It's a ring. It also goes with an app. It's a tracking device. It has a panic button on it. You can link it to different rings. Like if your friend has a ring and you feel like you're in trouble, you hit the panic button, your friend's ring will vibrate. Or you can also program within the app to dispatch the authorities if that's what you choose, or a trusted friend or something like that. So anytime I'm in a public space, this is one thing that I do to protect myself, because the reality is, I mean, and just as a woman first, right? I'm still wearing this. But anytime I'm in a public space as a performer at a trade show, I'm definitely wearing it.
If I can just follow up on Barb's point about, I suppose, the waiver and the signage, which is a really good start to things. I think what also is important to think about is the capacity, the ability to report when incidents happen, and then enforcement. So what does happen if somebody does transgress those boundaries? Because I think if effective enforcement action is taken and that a person is caught and ejected from premises, and I think if there's like a kind of reporting at the end of the show to kind of say these are the type of incidents or the number of incidences that happen, that would build, I think, more confidence maybe with performers. And I'm framing that obviously as a question.
See, this reminds me, I used to be a student, a geography student at the University of Portsmouth. That's how Paul and I got in contact. And when I was at university, I oversaw the Portsmouth branch of a website called ihollerback.org. And the one thing that we did was we mapped where incidents of catcalling, wolf whistling, any shape of harassment, no matter how big or small, happened to women on the streets. And we mapped it to look for patterns. Perhaps if we had something like that implemented at the trade shows, and from a geographical element, I'd love to map it perhaps where certain booths are, depending on the content they're putting out and the type of fans that may attract, and to see if there's a correlation. I think that could be quite a fascinating insight when it comes back to branding.
Spoken like a true scholar.
Another life.
Now is a good time to hit the pause button and head over to our Patreon at patreon.com/peepshowpodcast. Even $1 a month shows us that you care and want to see Peep Show continue to thrive. Also, you can help increase our reach with a review on iTunes.
It is interesting to think about kind of the construction of space, because one of the things that I noticed yesterday walking around the main trade show floor and talking with a friend of mine who was working for one of the camming companies is that this particular company had all their performers up on risers, like really up here. So I was like this, trying to talk. I mean, really like my back arched, my neck craned. It was like not conducive to just having a simple hello, how are you conversation. And it was so different than previous years. And this is my 13th show. I've been coming for a long time, so I've seen the evolution of this trade show. And it immediately made us both think, was this an actual physical intervention to kind of put performers up out of the way of grabby fans, to create kind of more of a barrier to prevent those unwanted interactions, and maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. I mean, it makes sense if it was, but it really it created challenges just for me to have a conversation and for them to have a conversation with me. But I think that those types of institutional interventions can take many different forms. It can take a consent form that people are signing. It can be signage outside the trade show floor, or it can be an actual physical reconfiguration of the trade show floor to create conditions where performers feel safer and aren't as easy to access.
That tall booth there can have an unintended consequence because it was so inaccessible that a performer actually had to come all the way down and get all the way away, so that it left you more vulnerable if you actually wanted to interact with a fan. which is part of what you need to do. So it could backfire in some ways.
So, in all of the years that I've been coming to the show, this is my 20th year in the business, and signing for Wicked, we always had our performers on risers, or we always had them a bit less accessible than just standing by a signing table on the floor. And I'll speak briefly as to why, in my opinion, that's not being done as much, and it's budget. It's the cost to a company to build that booth in order to keep those performers protected.
Add on that and just say that's the consequence of streaming free porn.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a ripple effect of what happens when you don't pay for your porn. It does affect everyone, from performers in the front line to crew. The whole system collapses.
Yeah, I mean, fascinating. I hadn't thought about it in terms of kind of just cost effectiveness. Interesting. Yeah, why don't we take the time that we have, and we have a little over 10 minutes, and there's a hand that shot up in the back. I see you, so please.
Hello, I want to thank all the panelists for being here. I do want to point out before I say this that I have to understand I have a privilege as a male and a privilege as a big male. I'm a new performer, and when I started coming to this industry, I was really amazed at how cautious all the female performers had to be. It's just not something that had occurred to me. I've friends that it took them 6-7 months before they trusted me with their real name because you can be in such danger in such crazy situations. And so one of the things I'm kind of thinking about is we have this whole camming community that's coming online with young talent that what are we doing to educate them on protecting themselves online? Within the AVN space, there are so many safeguards and social expectations and security that, I'm not going to say it's safer, nothing's ever safe, but what can we do as performers to help these women protect themselves online? Because a lot of them don't know that they have the right to say no. That just because that they're performing, the power's in their hands, it's informed consent. And so I tell every cis male, if you want to understand informed consent, go into a gay bar.
So that's it. Thank you for your comment and for your questions, and also welcome to the business. I think that because the business has been through so many changes so rapidly over the years, we are left with this space, a few new generations even of performers that don't have the resources or the tools or even the presence or awareness yet to understand bodily autonomy. So I think that when we're talking about that, we have to take a broader look at the bigger picture and realize that much more education is needed in that area overall. But if we zoom in, I would say that one thing that we could do, an actionable thing that we could all do, is talk to newer performers, even if we're just saying it to one person or two people or a handful of people, or if we are putting it out on our social media, sort of reminding them that they are the ones in control. And to me now, that seems like a really obvious thing, but it's definitely not something that I came into my sexuality understanding, right? So everybody's at a different spot, and I think people just need to be reminded that they are in control of their bodies.
Can I just add to that? Sexologist, sex therapist Dr. David Lay recently did a video for, I think it was Strip Chat or one of the forums, and he was looking at self-care and well-being, and it was particularly geared towards the CAM community, basically. So I think there's public service announcement video type stuff that can be done, and David and others are kind of in that space. But I also think there's opportunity here for performers to do similar stuff, and you only need 1 minute little clips on your Twitter feed or your Instagram video feed as well, basically, just to kind of highlight these particular issues. As long as you use hashtags, which Instagram and others allow you to hashtag and that they come up in feed. So we have to be creative about which ones we actually use. Not too porny, because they won't let you bloody use them.
There's one other thing I want to add to say, not to put everything on the performer's responsibility, but I'm involved in this another research study where we did a big survey of clients of sex workers and compared with a similar study in the UK. And we've got a book coming out in a month or so called Paying for Sex in the Digital Age. But one of the important things we found that in the UK, where there's a lot of online sex work still going on because they didn't have SESTA FOSTA, that there are some platforms where clients interact with each other that are being a little more proactive in educating clients and consumers in how to interact appropriately. And that is another thing that could be the responsibility of platforms to do.
Can I add on that? There's a really amazing organisation I'm a big fan of called Pineapple Support. And they're I love them, and they're very eager to make sure that performer mental health is the forefront of their priority. And any support the greater public could make to give towards them, give them some attention would be wonderful. And I'm sure they would happily implement perhaps doing a video like that in terms of how to respect a cam performer in a cam room.
And I really appreciate that the first question came from a man, because we did have a male performer on the panel, and unfortunately he wasn't able to make it. And I think hearing men talk about consent and how they navigate consent is crucial. Just absolutely crucial. Another hand up here.
I'm wondering how you go about having the consent conversation without coming off as like abrasive or maybe aggressive, especially like in this space where like we want to be viewed as accessible and friendly and positive. Just having that conversation without it almost being like a negative or making assumptions about people.
So I think that every time we negotiate consent here in this space with fans, we're sort of doing it on a continuum, right? And we're doing it sort of depending on what's happening, how their attitude is, how they're approaching us, how safe we feel, where are we, what time of day is it, what are we doing? So those are all like different variables in this equation. I think the best thing that we can do is to just be direct. And if they take your being direct as being a bitch or being abrasive or that's too bad. You're protecting yourself and setting boundaries for yourself. And that's it. Because no amount of bullshit that you're going to put up with is going to be worth it.
Our fans know us. If you follow us online, they have a sense of your personality, your brand. I'm very fortunate that the fans I've attracted are super respectful. And I also want to, in defense of fans, I just want to say that majority, 99.9% of the people I meet here are phenomenal, because there are peers, we're like-minded community who are sexually liberated and just here to celebrate the most natural, beautiful art form that is a natural high from sex. And it's that 0.0111% that ruins it for the rest of us.
Other questions?
Yeah, just a quick one. Is anybody showing the Porn 101 videos at all that AIM used to have? And I'm thinking that the Performers Association would be a good place to create various videos that deal with topics exactly like this. Do you happen to know if APAC is planning to do that?
So APAC has done some performer videos, and I believe that Lotus Lane is starting sort of a program for newer performers. So that would definitely be something to look for.
You guys come for the fans and the fans come for you guys. So with that in mind, do you think that the fans come because they think that their fantasies will come true here, or for something else?
That question's obviously not for me because I'm not in the industry, So I will defer to my esteemed colleagues to the left and right.
So I think it's probably a mix, right? I think that the majority of people that I've met, men and women that are coming to shows to meet me, they've watched my movies, they're super fans, right? They just want to see me in person. Like, they want to hear how I really am. They want to watch me, my actual mannerisms, not characters that I'm playing in a movie. Do I think that they're also hoping their fantasy will come true? Absolutely. completely. And even though, like, I mean, I might hold the same fantasy about a celebrity that I would hope to meet one day, but that doesn't mean I'm going to put my hands on them without consent, right? And I think that it is sort of what we do and the fact that we are naked and that's how people see us, and maybe they think that they have a better chance of having that fantasy come true. And I'm not saying that no one at a show ever hooks up with a fan. I'm not saying that either. So fantasies do come true sometimes.
Although, if I could,
consensually.
Yeah. If I could add to this, though, in a way, in terms of the fantasy becoming as close to reality as possible. So Jessica and others, for example, have fleshlights. And if you're engaged in VR porn, okay, and you put the goggles on and you put a fleshlight on, that's the closest in a virtual reality sense that your fantasy is real, that you have been intimate with Jessica Drake or whatever other performers have a fleshlight. So there's a way of kind of conceiving this in terms of realizing fantasy as a form of reality.
We probably have time for one more quick question. Yes, right there.
Hi, thank you so much. You had mentioned kind of loosely financial barriers to your physical security, primarily, I would assume, from the companies that you work for. How can that change? Because that's safety, right? We're in a big space. Like in my mind, when I hear that, I'm like, well, that sounds like bullshit. You know what I mean? Like, that doesn't sound like, there's security guards here and these kinds of things. I'm just curious how we could change that for performers.
I'm going to chime in and say pay for your porn. It's something I can't stress enough. And I'm sure a lot of people over the years have noticed that a lot of big companies have gone under. And it's because of the change in the way we consume pornography. And I think generally the consensus is that under 35 age group have never paid for porn and think the idea of it is absurd. So support your performers, support the companies, anything you can do to help contribute to them. It will have a very positive ripple effect onto the rest of us. And support if your favorite performer has a subscription platform. Invest in it, support them. Even if it's $1 you're donating a month, you can help them pay for their own security or for the ring that Jessica has. Little things make a big difference.
I think that's a great place to end. And, I'm sure many of you might have questions. You might be able to grab one of the panelists and ask them. There is 10 minutes before the next panel starts. I hope you stick around. It's a performer-oriented panel. I'm sure it's going to be terrific, but the 10-minute breaks gives people like Jessica time to catch her breath before she jumps on the next panel. But thank you so much, everyone in the audience, for taking time to come and listen to this.
Thank you for joining us for yet another episode of the Peep Show podcast. I'm PJ Sage, and you can find me on Twitter at PeachSage.
And I'm Jessie Sage, and you can find me on Twitter at sapiotextual or at jessiesage.com.
We would like to remind you that we have a Patreon account and would appreciate your support. Please visit patreon.com/peepshowpodcast. Our music is courtesy of Joe Kennedy. The show was produced by Jessie and PJ Sage.
Signing off. Have a great week.